What's up, y'all? It's Thien back with another video today. Today's video is going to be about the software engineer application process. In this video, I'll be talking about building a strong foundation to get through the barrier for entry, the different strategies to apply for jobs, and the pros and cons of each one, what worked for me and what didn't. So I'll be talking about building a strong resume and strong profile in a later video, but just understand that regardless of whatever method you decide is best for you or whatever method you choose for your application process, understand that you still need a strong foundation, which is the resume, because that's what's getting your foot in the door and getting interviews. Now, when it comes to the actual applications and applying for jobs, there's 3 different methods that I like to talk about. I know there might be others out there. Feel free to drop that down below. But for me, the 3 main ones are hot applies, warm applies, and cold applies. Hot applies are knowing the decision makers at companies that can get you through the interview process, get you straight to the final round, or even get you straight to the job without interviewing at times. Now, this is not very common as it requires a lot of nepotism. Now, the other method that I mentioned is warm applies. This is reaching out to people of affluence on LinkedIn or even blind and getting referrals. So think like hiring managers, other engineers, or even recruiters. And the third method that I like to talk about is cold applies. So the pros and cons of each one. The pros of hot applies. Well, the pro is definitely that you don't have to put in much work and effort because you just get the job or get straight to the final round. That's a huge pro. Now, the con is that this is not very common. Like I said, it requires a lot of nepotism, requires a strong network, it requires you to know very powerful people, people in the industry, people that are higher up, and that's just not very common. Pros and cons when it comes to warm applies. The pros is that, this is more of a qualitative approach. You end up getting referrals, so you get, when you have referrals, you have kind of a solid benchmark when it comes to the interviews because, someone referred you in. So someone that referred you usually already worked there. So there's already a good, background for you. And the con with this is that it might take a little bit more time consumption because it does leave a variable of other people in mind. Because you got to wait for other people to reply to you, you got to wait for other people to refer you, and there's just a lot in between that's happening and a lot of moving variables that might, increase the time frame from job application to job offer or even interviews. Third approach that I was talking about is cold applying. This is, my bread and butter, which is just applying, sending in your applications and sending in your resumes to all the companies and all the job listings that are out there. I think one approach that I want to mention that I will not be going to too much detail on is the passive approach, which is to build profiles on things like hire.com that will get you interviews and without you even having to apply. This will still require a strong, resume because you're going to essentially, migrate your resume information over to these platforms. And these platforms are definitely something that worked for me as well. And so I think a pro and con with the passive approach is that, it's a one-time setup and done, and you don't have to actively apply to jobs, and you still gain interviews. I think this is something that everyone should do, and keep that in mind when you're applying to jobs. So what did not work for me? What did not work for me was the hot applies when I was first entering the tech market. I didn't know anyone in tech, let alone anyone higher up in tech. So that just didn't work for me. I couldn't do that. I couldn't reach out to anyone because I didn't know anyone. Warm applies kind of worked for me, but it wasn't my favorite, so I'm kind of going to mention this in the what did not work for me because, well, the approach just was too time-consuming. And my first time around when it came to the job search, I was on a time crunch. I had a runway. I didn't want to move back home, and I needed to find a job stat, so I couldn't risk, the time frame that was, uncertain when it came to the time that someone, received my message and then how long it took for them to refer me and all this, things that happen in between. There's just too many moving variables with the warm applies. So this kind of segues into what did work for me, especially when it came to the warm applies. What did work for me in the warm applies, though, is that when I was not being around the bush and I took the no-frills approach to warm applies, when I just reached out to people that worked at companies that I saw job listings for, and I just said, hey, I'm looking for a job here. I saw this listing. Here's my resume. Send it if you can. If not, it's cool. Still apply to the job, right? I was still doing the cold approach, but I mixed in the warm applies where I saw applicable. And then it also worked out really well on this platform called Blind because everyone on there is just shooting out referrals left and right because everyone's trying to make a couple grand per referral because of the incentives that companies give them. So that was another thing to mention as well. But I think the number one thing and my favorite method when it came to applying for jobs due to sheer numbers was the cold apply approach. I mean, I had the setup for this, yo. I was laying in bed applying the jobs on my phone. Instead of scrolling social media, I was just applying the jobs, and I was able to apply to 1 to 2 jobs a minute with this method, laying in bed on my phone. And all I had to do was just upload my resume or send the resume via email, and then open the resume on my phone and then save it to my files. I have iPhone. I think you can do this on Android as well. And then I just upload the resume to LinkedIn from the LinkedIn app. And then on the LinkedIn app, I was just scrolling through jobs on that. And I think this is another video that I'm gonna talk about too when it came to like searching for the actual jobs. And I think if I were to give like a concise, summary of what I think you should do when it came to searching for the jobs and finding the listings is to search by skill set rather than software engineer as a whole. You can definitely look up just software engineer, but you gotta remember the practice of software engineering. There's just so much that goes into it. There's so many different languages and different companies and everything. So if you wanna, tailor your approach, you can start by top down, more broad approach and apply to everything there. But I took the inside out approach. I looked for all jobs. I knew that had a higher, success rate for me, which was React jobs that, catered towards React developers, because that was like my bread and butter skill set. And so I was looking for React when it came to looking for jobs on LinkedIn and Indeed or wherever you want to search your job listings. And so I just applied to jobs based on those search parameters and went from there. In conclusion, what works for one person doesn't work for everyone. These are just what worked for me. And the most important part, again, is the profile and resume. Without it, you won't even get looked at. So you want to oversell yourself as much as possible. Only use years without months. Be verbose as possible. I'll go into more detail about this in a future video, but those are just kind of some things I want to mention there. But again, the resume and the foundation is what gets you in the door. You need to get through the job portal. Without that, you're not going to be able to interview at all. And without interviews, you're not going to be able to get job offers. And without job offers, you're not going to be able to get a job. So keep that in mind. Me personally, I like to play the numbers game, but that's my preferred method. Let me know what method works for you. Peace.